Unbelievable. No one. This was 200 years ago. Half the audience would have raised their hand for the first question. Every one of you would have raised their hand for the second question. And let me ask you, what happened? Where'd they go? Why don't we have cholera, malaria, and yellow fever in the United States anymore? We know they're warm weather diseases, and if someone else wants to have a debate with me over later whether the Earth's really warming or not, I'll have that debate. They're warm weather diseases, and North America's gotten warmer. They're prevalent throughout much of the developing world. Just told you that a cab driver who suffered from malaria in his home country. Where'd they go? Why don't we have these diseases in the United States anymore? You know why? Society, led by government, tough word, government, wiped them out. Wiped them out. How? We figured out that malaria and yellow fever were caused by certain kinds of mosquitoes, and we had government-led mosquito eradication efforts and public health efforts. Cholera is an even better example. We figured out, we human beings figured out, that cholera wasn't just a natural part of the environment, that had always been here, always will be. It was caused by human civilization. It was caused by bad water. So what happened? City after city, county after county, town after town, built municipal water systems. Municipal is also a nicer word for that evil word government. Municipal water systems. And guess what? They worked. I'll give you a specific example from my hometown, New York. Some of you guys visit New York, you've had our pizza and bagels, right? I'm going to give you guys your barbecue and your Rocky Mountain oysters. But I'm sorry to tell you, bagel is not a white bread with a hole. We are proud that New York has the best pizza and bagels in the world, we believe. And part of that is because of our unique water supply. So not only did our water supply give us incredible bagels and pizza, it almost entirely wiped out cholera. Pretty good side benefit. There's a website on the New York City Department, there's a page on the New York City Department of Health website that has a chart that I picked up one night when I was researching my book. And by the way, I usually speak much more quickly, but because I'm in the laconic West, I slow down. Just want to let you know. Just want to let you know I slow down for you. And there's a chart labeled Death from Pestilence in New York City. Now that's my kind of fun nighttime reading. Death from Pestilence in New York City. And it showed cholera, 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 cholera going through the roof. It showed the Croton Reservoir System created to bring fresh water into New York City. Cholera went away almost overnight. This is a massive system that brings water from 120 miles away in some cases. Rivals the Roman aqueduct system, and let me suggest that couldn't have been done by private corporations on their own, that couldn't have been done by faith-based entities, couldn't have been done by the nonprofit sector, only could have been done in a coordinated manner on our behalf in a democracy with democratically elected officials who made it happen, and it worked. We no longer have cholera in New York City. Now, a lot of people back then also believed that these problems were poor people's fault. And that's why we have them. And I think it's no shock to know that many Americans today think that the prime cause of poverty and hunger is that it's poor people's fault. They're not working hard enough, they're having too many children. I love when in New York City they say they shouldn't have moved here. Well, many of them, because it's too expensive, and people say that. They shouldn't have moved here. Let them move to a lower place. Same people who often say family, family, family is the centerpiece of all social policy, want people to move around leaving their grandparents behind, or dragging their kids to another community every week. And that's what people believe. Honestly, I think fewer people believe that than a decade ago, when all the myth was the only reason poor people are poor is they're not working hard enough. I think more people understand now that there's some economic factors. Now, sometimes I think conservatives demonize poor people, and I'll tell you, I'm not going to be easy on liberals either. I think sometimes they glamorize poor people. And I will tell you that sometimes low-income people are fundamentally irresponsible. Sometimes rich people are fundamentally irresponsible. If you don't believe that, I have 6 words for you. Lindsay Lohan, Charlie Sheen, and Paris Hilton. And so, I don't think we ought to discard behavior, but let's look at the bulk of the problem, and let's look at social science as a fact. When I started working for President Clinton in the early 1990s, we were told that the reason people are poor and hungry is they're on welfare, they aren't working enough, they're having too many children, there's too much crime. Well, welfare was dramatically reduced, cash welfare. Less than 10% of the poor people in America are now on welfare. Teenage pregnancy rates declined, in many big cities crime rates declined, the crack epidemic ebbed, and guess what? Poverty increased. So maybe there's some hard statistical evidence that irresponsibility of poor people wasn't the prime reason that hunger and poverty increased in America. I know some may disagree, and I'm going to have questions and answers after this, but I'm talking about verified facts. So I don't think irresponsibility is the prime reason. I think the prime reason is people are working hard and aren't paid enough to feed their families. I believe education needs to be enhanced in the society. We need to make sure that more Americans can compete in the world economy by graduating high school, going on to get a post-secondary education if they can, and if it'll advance their careers. Absolutely. There's no question. And the reason I say this is, when I give this talk, one of the first questions is always going to be, what about education? And then the side issue, what about food? Education. I also say, if you can't afford food and it doesn't exist in your neighborhood, and after your third job and traveling by public transportation, you don't have time to prepare that food, all the education in the world isn't going to matter. We should have it, but it's got to go hand in hand with affordability and accessibility. Now, someone has got to clean the rooms in this hotel tonight. Someone is probably cleaning the office in which you work at night. Someone is taking care of our children in daycare centers. Someone is helping take care of our parents or grandparents. Someone is a night watchman. None of those jobs need a college degree, and I suggest every one of them should be paid a living wage so they can feed their families. Let's also take the assumption about these diseases that there's just a set level of these that we have to accept. Well, the truth is that's not true. While it's widely assumed that nothing ever works on poverty, that we have a similar level of poverty we had a few decades ago, that implies that poverty's been at this constant level, when in fact it dramatically plummeted due to a certain set of policies and actions, and then dramatically went up due to a certain set of other actions. So to say it's at the same level, therefore nothing works, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really make sense. That's like saying because it's as warm this October day as last October, it's not colder in February or higher in July. And some people say, oh, we had efforts, and they didn't end poverty, they didn't end hunger, so they weren't working, let's get rid of them. I think in most major cities of the United States over the last few decades, we dramatically reduced crime. One of the reasons was we placed many more police on the beat. So I don't hear people saying, well, there's still some crime, it didn't work, get rid of the cops. That makes as much sense as saying there's still some poverty and hunger, get rid of these programs. If you ask me, they were working, a more logical answer in my mind was, let's get more people these programs. So the truth is, between 1960 and 1973, you've heard that none of these programs worked, right? Many progressives have told none of these programs worked. Between 1960 and 1973, the poverty rate in America was cut in half. Let me repeat that. Between 1960 and 1973, the poverty rate in America was cut in half. 16 million Americans left poverty and entered the middle class. If that's failure, I really want to see success. It was working, we just stopped doing some of those things. Let me be more specific about hunger, finally get to hunger. In my book, I found, in researching my book, I found a master's thesis from Frances Perkins. You guys ever heard that name? You will after my screenplay about her life. She's, to me, one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. She was not only the first cabinet secretary in New York State history, worked for then Governor Al Smith. She was also the first U.S. federal cabinet secretary. She was the Secretary of Labor for Franklin Roosevelt. She helped create the Social Security Act. She helped create minimum wage legislation. She helped create worker safety legislation. And she has a building named after her in Washington, D.C. One of the few people who actually has a building named after him that deserved it. In Washington. I'm sure all the people, all your buildings are named after here, all deserve it. She also wrote a master's thesis in 1910 as a young student at my alma mater, Columbia, on hunger in New York City in 1910. And she went into the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, which then was primarily Irish-American and Italian-American immigrants. Didn't speak the language. A lot of the people who had been here just a few years earlier really didn't like them. An aside, I must say about immigration, since I haven't covered every controversial topic yet, I must add that I think we're a nation of anti-immigrant immigrants. Honestly, when people hunt for me, oh, if they don't speak the language, they shouldn't be here, I say, how's your Iroquois? And I must say one more aside about that. In New York City, if you've been on a subway and you think no one else can fit on the subway, no one else can possibly fit on the subway, someone else pushes them on. Have you ever been on a subway and seen that? For you guys, I laughed out here. There are like 3 people on the elevator, no one gets on. Oh, too bad. Like 1,000 people, this one subway car, someone else pushes their way on. You think no one else can fit. And who gets on at the next subway stop? Someone else pushes themselves on. And who is maddest that that person pushed themselves on? The previous person who got it, and that's how we are about immigration. But anyway, so, back then in New York City, we tend to think of, too, our stereotype that poverty is a non-white problem. For most of American history, and even today, the majority of people poor are white. Let's get that straight. So, Frances Perkins went with a team of doctors, and she cataloged what these kids were eating and not eating. And they were truly starving, as you may see in Darfur today. I told you we don't have quite that problem today yet, because we do, even though half the people in the state eligible for food stamps aren't getting it, still large numbers are. Large numbers of kids are getting school lunches. So we don't have that starvation today, but she found literally kids starving to death the way you might in Darfur. And she documented in mind-numbing detail. They'd have maybe, rarely a piece of rancid old meat, rarely any old vegetables, almost never fresh vegetables. If they were lucky, some milk, but often that was rancid and dangerous, and people often died from bad milk back then, and that was the reality. Because in 1910, there was no food stamps program, there was no school lunch program, no school breakfast program, no summer meals program, no after-school snacks program. There were soup kitchens or missions that served primarily indigent men, but the whole idea of a food pantry, didn't even come into existence until the 1980s. Some of you are probably with food pantries, and I can bet virtually none of you were in existence till before the 1980s. You remember when it was supposed to be temporary? So, we have this problem. The food stamps program was created as a pilot program during the New Deal. It was a voucher program, basically, a coupon discount program, where you got some discounts on food if you put a little money down. The first recipient of food stamps benefits in the mid-1930s was Mabel McFiggin. That has nothing to do with the rest of my talk, but I just can't say Mabel McFiggin over and over and over again. You may know the school lunch program was created as a defense program. A defense program. Because generals came to President Truman and said, Mr. President, our boys are too hungry to fight. Our boys are too hungry to fight. And so some of the most conservative members of the United States Congress, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, a very, very, very conservative Southern Democrat, who today I think it's fair to say if he had the same ideology, he'd be Republican, was the chief author of the School Lunch Act because he understood that we cannot fight, we cannot be strong, either military or economically, if we are not well nourished. And let me say that if you are not well fueled, you will not be well schooled. That's my one Jesse Jackson moment here. Okay, one more. Okay, I'll come back to that. Okay, if you're not well fed, you can't be well read. My second rhyme for the day. That'll be my only rhyme for the day. And those programs worked. And some of the programs of the 60s worked. But by the late 1960s, we still had pockets of third world style malnutrition in America. How do we know? Because doctors went around the country, teams of doctors went and documented this problem.